I'd like to bring to order the Budget and Oversight Public Elections of the Budget and Oversight Subcommittee of the Elections Commission. Time is 6:02? 6:01?
Yes.
Yes, 6:01 p.m. The date is the 1st of November 2017. Present are, well, I guess I will let our secretary please call the roll.
Okay, Chair Donaldson.
Here?
Vice President Harris.
Here.
Commissioner Savant.
Here.
All are present.
Great. We'd also like to welcome Director Arntz to the meeting. Okay, item two, please.
General public comment. Public comment on any issues within Bopec's general jurisdiction unless otherwise included in an item on the agenda.
Seeing no members of the public, we can move on to item 3.
Item 3, open source voting. Discussion and possible action regarding the City and County of San Francisco's open source voting systems project.
So, Director Arntz, just kind of wanted to get a general update. We're at this point, we included in the agenda pack the proposal from Solemn along with the contract, which I guess was finalized about a month ago. But there's already, at least in this timeline that was in the Appendix A, there's already deliverables basically as of last week, is what I understand. So I guess the first question would be just generally if they're making their timelines and how that's going.
Yeah, I think so. It's, the time in the contract's actually 2 weeks later than the final execution of the contract. So the September 29th date was when we finished everything as far as the city's requirements are concerned, but it took another 2 weeks actually for the city to do an additional review of the contract and all of its components, and before it was inputted into the budget system, and then funding was connected to the agreement. So we're still not quite at the stage where the first set of deliverables are due. It will actually be next week, end of next week. So they did send me something this evening. I haven't looked at it. Maybe it's something in relation to the deliverables, but right now Solemn's been meeting with a lot of folks in City Hall, outside of City Hall. They met with Commissioner Jordanic early in the process, meeting with folks regarding the accessibility requirements, the security requirements, the certification requirements. So that's been ongoing for several weeks, and I'm sure it'll continue through the process too as they gain more information. But they've been very active. I've been helping with setting up lots. I've probably set up at least 10-15 meetings with folks in city government.
Great.
So yeah, I mean, things are happening. They're getting information. They're meeting folks. So
Okay. So having started 2 weeks later than this on this timeline, are you slipping the end date or just crunching it to the 2 weeks, or has that been discussed? Because the timeline was already pretty compact.
yeah, they're going to still try to get by the end of the year, beginning of next year. So there's a period to look for so the city can look at the initial draft. Need water?
I should leave.
No, I'm serious.
That's all right.
But yes, but just like right now, there's no product, there's no thing that I have in my hand
Right.
in relation to the business case.
Okay. So the other thing it said in here is I saw that there was the way the fee schedule was set up. It was like at certain points tied to deliverables. So I think that's what it is. Can you just go over that? Maybe I'm looking at this Appendix B, and just whether that means. And I guess my main interest is as they deliver these things, whether or not that becomes a public document we can look at. Just because at the end, particularly in terms of that final assessment and review, that would be the overall document. But if the public could review sections of this, if you felt that was, and anyway, what your thoughts are there.
Yeah, I don't know. I thought about that before I came up. I don't have the answer. I think so, but I don't want to say with certainty. I don't have I can answer at the commission meeting. But
Okay.
It would, yeah, it would be a product of the contract, so I would think that it would be
Yeah.
disclosable.
Yeah, I mean, I could imagine being subject to revision, but obviously things like, for example, as we look at the functional requirements, I personally would be very interested in knowing what that are, like D2 section, because obviously that's essential to the rest of it. And I'm sure that the TAC would, like to understand what's already there and things like that. So we have alignment around those things. So, okay, that would be great. Yeah, if you could check that out and let us know at the full commission meeting, that would be terrific. And then how it might be made available. Okay. So the one other thing, and what made me think about that, by the way, was the one other thing is when I actually read this section, when I read the description of D2 in Appendix A. Appendix A, page A3. It talks about confirms software functional requirements. So when I read, and I went back through it, and I couldn't find where the functional requirements were first written. So I didn't know if that meant that they're developing that. Are they actually developing the functional requirements, or are you giving them something?
No, so the functional requirements would be for their model. So they're not actually designing a system, they're designing a model by which they'll move through the evaluation process. And so I can't give all the answers. That's just, but from my understanding of their approach, that's how they'll use information like software requirements, but they're not actually creating a system and then evaluating each component of the system. They're going to create a model and try to give structure, time, and cost around the feasibility of the city developing that model.
Right. Yeah, because they talk about the number of processes, number of activities, required capabilities, and I guess in the required capabilities, I suppose that would be more detail. It's just when they use the word confirm, it sounds like they're getting something from somebody already.
Well, that's to confirm their model.
Okay.
So that's for them to set their standards, not necessarily to finalize a system, but for them to finalize their model, which they'll move forward in the assessment process.
Okay. Okay. Got it. All right. So yeah, it would. So once again, it'd be if they're delivering that as part of that first phase and getting paid for it. If that's something that could be made public, I think it would be greatly appreciated. The final thing is that reading their proposal, which was pretty interesting actually, to see their approach to this. So it looks like a lot of these elements just have to do with how they're going to go about doing it. What's really documented in Appendix A and B is what they're delivering. And so I guess because I didn't see any of this, I guess the question is this the approach they're taking? And then really what's documented in A and B is their deliverables?
Right. So the contract is tied back to the RFP.
Right.
Whereas the bid is their response to the RFP.
Right.
So they're different. And so when the selection panel received the bids were in response to the RFP. And so the selection panel made decisions on which bid was closest to the RFP. But then when the negotiations begin for the contract, you tie it back to the RFP directly, not their best efforts to understand the project.
Okay.
But you're tying everything back to the scope of work in the RFP. But I do think that their bid does explain their process
Their
overall.
methodology.
Yeah, right, their methodology, right.
Right. Okay. Got it. So when I see these letters such as D1, D2, all that stuff, that would be in the RFP.
Right, yeah.
Got it.
Yeah, it's tied
I
right
guess
to
I
the scope of
didn't
work
make
in
that
the
connection
RFP.
myself. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Got it. Yeah, I mean, this looks, the way they've organized this and things and how their proposal is, I mean, they look like you made a good selection from an outsider point of view. Commissioners, any questions on
Well,
your
this
part?
is totally all Greek to me, but it seemed to look, it was arranged in a way that was kind of, well, I can't say easy for me to understand, but I could grasp what was going on.
Okay.
Are we getting anything other than paper at the end of
Lots of
January?
paper.
I mean, it could be good paper, but are we getting anything other than paper at the end of January, the 17-week period?
Well, we're not getting paper because it's all delivered digitally.
Electronic.
Yeah.
Good response, good response. And I didn't expect anything like, even close to like a prototype or whatever, but I want to know at the end of 17 weeks, what are we going to feel confident about?
I don't know. I couldn't tell you. I'm not the one doing this.
Exactly.
You know, but what they're not designing a system. They're assessing options. And so I don't know what their assessment will look like. And as far as confidence levels are concerned, I can't answer that for you.
Okay. Is that, any other questions, commissioners?
Well, I was trying to read this. I had some questions, but I left all my notes.
Okay. Well, if they come up, there will be other opportunities. And certainly, if there's other things that people want to ask, this could be placed on the main commission. Further review could be placed on the main commission agenda. The one other thing which comes to the next, and I'm not sure whether to place it here or in the next agenda item, but is the relationship kind of between this and the interim system. I think there was small reference here to something about there would be a replacement system in the RFP. I remember that, but I only found one reference to it. It kind of was the overview of the project, if I recall. And so I don't know, when I actually look at these deliverables, how much they're taking that into account. It seems like this is pretty much all focused on the new system. Is that right? They aren't taking into account, for example, or are they, I guess is the question, when they look at this, the first parts really have to do with an assessment of the system itself, right. And then you start getting into deployment and operational, elements. And I guess the question of the extent to which the deployment will take into account this replacement system that we will have that will be leased. Like in the deployment approaches, for example, F2. And or vice versa, will the contract take that into account?
Where are you? I'm sorry.
So F2 was the deployment approaches and
Appendix B.
yeah. And I'm not sure, I thought we had the
No, so this assessment is for an independent system.
right.
So it's not based on any other existing systems.
Okay. So in your thought process right now would be we'd have this system and there'd be a cutover from the old system for components or whatever, and we deal with that separately, and this deployment approach would not take that into account, that there's an existing system in place.
I mean, I don't know, because I'm not the one preparing it, but, so
I guess I would just like, maybe just some input, that when it comes to this deployment approach, and then also as we get into the next item, which has to do with the interim system and the recommendations from the TAC, it does talk about having it an existing system, replacing it like, possible approaches such as component, at a component level of replacing that. So I guess I just ask that when they consider deployment approaches, they think about not as though we're just going to abandon that entire system and think about deploying.
Yeah, my guess is that Commissioner Jordanek mentioned that
Okay.
approach to them. And I think he was the second interview that Slalom had. So from the very beginning of their process, it's the second or third, this idea, which I would imagine that Commissioner Jordanek also shares with you, was something that was communicated to Slalom.
Okay.
So I'm sure when it comes to whatever models they put together, which I've not seen,
Okay.
that they will take into account those approaches that you have in mind.
Okay. Okay. And I guess the other thing is that if we are able to look at these deliverables as they deliver them, it'll also be an opportunity for that feedback. So, okay. Okay. I don't have any other questions on this agenda item right now, I don't think. Well, I guess I do have one other question. In terms of, it was mentioned at the last commission meeting about the recommendations of the TAC, and I know this is all sort of uncharted territory, not clear how to do this, but The TAC is trying to, think about things that maybe ahead of, let's say, somebody like a slalom. And the request, I think the motion and request was that these recommendations be read by somebody. So just wondering if, since you are, my understanding of what they're doing is they're actually physically embedded in the elections officer, have desks here or something. Just wondering, so they're around, and whether these recommendations are being conveyed to them, or it's up to them to go find them, and if there's any way of.
Well, they attended TAC, so they actually went to the TAC meeting, the last one. I don't know if they'll go to the next one, but they were at the most recent TAC meeting. They know what's on the website. They know the materials that are being put out, so it's known to them.
Okay. So the expectation right now is that they know that it's out there, they know what the TAC is, we think that there's a relationship there of some sort, even if it's just one of awareness, and they can go and get the recommendations on their own.
Oh, yeah, I pointed out the TAC to them in the beginning. Oh, yeah, they're aware of the TAC.
Okay.
They attended the meeting, they met with Commissioner Jordanic.
Right.
I don't know if there's been something questions or not, so yeah,
Okay.
certainly.
Okay, I think that should be fine. So at least we think there's a connection there. We'll also be able to see and some of these things they could reject, understood, and then if we can look at these documents as they're delivered, we can also give that feedback. Okay. Thank you. Any other questions?
No.
Any public comment? Seeing no members of the public?
Item 4, interim voting system replacement. Discussion and possible action regarding city and county of San Francisco's action to acquire a replacement voting system as an interim measure until an open source voting system is available.
So on this item, and I did specifically want to name this interim voting system because I just realized, Director Arndt, that in your director's reports it was just called the voting system replacement, and it seems to me, though I didn't actually go back and read minutes, that part of the conversation was that this was intended as an interim system. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to, in fact, confirm that. And since you are putting together the RFP, what are your thoughts at this point on what you're going to request in terms of how they're going to respond, and if it's, I believe you mentioned before it was a lease. I'd just like to get some ideas about how you were going to approach that replacement system.
Yeah, I don't want to say too much about an RFP, but
Sure.
But from the beginning, we've been open as it'll be a leasing situation.
Mm-hmm.
And the city doesn't really have any desire to buy a voting system at this point, probably going forward as well. So the RFP will be to lease a system. The system has to be approved by the Secretary of State for use in California.
Sure.
So that's going to be what the RFP is searching for.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be certified or approved to conduct ranked choice elections.
Mm-hmm.
And so so that kind of narrows the pool right there as well.
Sure.
So that's what the RFP is going to be asking for.
Okay.
How many vendors do you know, since that is already a very limited amount, are even possible providing that service?
Right now, one.
That's it.
Be the current vendor, right?
Okay.
It's kind of scary.
Yep.
Yeah. So that being the case, still, I'd just like to, request that, particularly in these recommendations, 5.1 talks about the interim voting system, and the thoughts being how we would approach an open source system, given that it might be built on a component basis. And as you said, I understand that you don't necessarily want to disclose how you're going to structure the RFP, so I guess it would be a request to take these into consideration. And even if that meant that if I'm the only responder, I might not want to respond to certain things that I didn't like, but I would just, request that we think about how that deployment strategy, how components might be replaced, and that be a consideration in.
Well, it really can't be a consideration because the system has to be approved. And so
Sure.
It has to be approved as a whole system. That's just the current approval process.
Sure.
Approval, and that's just how it is. So for us to say that we're going to issue an RFP that requires the replacement of pieces that have approved system with something that doesn't exist yet, it can't be done. You know, it's not feasible. And plus, asking a vendor, we don't have the even though we're issuing the RFP, we can't create it like our own approval process for voting systems. You know, we don't have that kind of control over the process. Even if we were to develop our own voting system, we would still have to have it approved.
Sure.
You know, so the recommendations are good, but they may not really fit into the process that's in place for voting systems to be approved for use. And to piece out parts of an approved system with a jurisdiction made part right now is not possible under the current approval scheme.
Okay.
So we got to keep that in mind. So the RFP is going to do what the previous RFP did, but instead of look for a purchase, it's going to look for a lease. So it's going to ask for a system that's approved for use in California that can conduct ranked choice elections. You know, and then with the lease, you can potentially change over the system if you go to the SB 450, if you go to the voting centers, if you move from polling place to voting centers. You've got that kind of flexibility because the components would still be approved as part of the whole system.
Right.
But to start removing parts of it and putting in other parts, that's not contemplated in the approval scheme. Does that make sense?
Well, I guess my understanding of the approvals is actually that you can bring whatever you want for approval. Obviously, the vendor would have to agree to some component being plugged into their system and an approval process that would include their system as well as perhaps some open source components. And I guess just the suggestion might be ask them if they would be open to that. Granted, it would be future unknown costs, but it would also be a way, and you know, it could wait for the future, but it could also be the case that maybe they would be open to, say, whatever it was, this tabulator being open source, and they would get their entire system recertified jointly with San Francisco at some future date, with that component being open source, for example.
You were talking about the approval. Are we talking about certification from the state? Are we talking about, all right, so that is what we were talking about. As you said, from what we have now, these sound good. They're not particularly feasible. So let's look down the road, hypothetically, say 5 years down the road. 5 years down the road, and we have signed a lease for an interim voting system for 6 years, say. We've had it for 5 years, this is our 6th year. And we now have a working prototype and off-the-shelf stuff that has finally been approved by the California Secretary of State. So it is approved software, and we have 1 year to go with this interim software. What are the legalities of then doing any kind of switch, or is our lease, or do you interpret that the lease would be very exclusive just to that equipment? Or is there any possibility of any of this gently adding in new stuff, little by little?
Right, the contract will be attached to what's in existence at the time of the execution of the agreement. And so if there's something that doesn't exist, you can't tie something into the agreement. You know, so a month, a year, 5 years, if it doesn't exist, you really can't bring it in, you can't contemplate it. But where I thought you were going to go with the question was, could we end the agreement before the 6 years? In the city, every contract the city executes, the ones that I've been involved in at least, there's a mechanism to allow for terminating a contract prior to the full term. And so, you know, if those circumstances were to come into play, the city could terminate the contract prior to full term, then implement the next system.
What are generally the consequences?
Depends what you put in the contract. You know, it all depends on the agreement. If you go in, and it's a lease situation, so really you're probably looking at a higher lease cost because there's more risk for the vendor going into the agreement than if they knew they're going to have full term and possibly longer. But then again, it's hard for me to forecast that. But that would be, and then the potential, well, not disposable equipment because you're leasing it. So yeah, there'd probably be some sort of financial cost figured into the calculation for the lease cost annually, my guess.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I understand, particularly with the size of San Francisco and the size of the market, it's hard to drive a vendor to things. But I guess I'm also just would suggest it might be worth putting something in there. I can anticipate what they might respond with, but whether that would be something they might be open to at some point, whether of incorporating open source components for elements of their system as a way forward.
So let's talk about the nightmare scenario. So from what you tell me, there's only one vendor, the current vendor, that has the capability of providing what is legally required in the city and county of San Francisco, which essentially gives them monopoly power. I'm sure that anybody with their ear to the ground knows that we're creating an open source system, and that we have passed resolutions, and there's money for the initial things, and we're steaming forward. So let's say that our current contract, or when it ends, we are in need of a new system, and the open source voting system is clearly not ready. What happens if the current vendor leverages their monopoly power, has us over a barrel with some ridiculous price, and kind of know it's their way or the highway? What's plan B? Because when we're talking about like, hey, can you be nice with your contract and let us add some stuff in even though we don't have it ready, and also, by the way, you can kind of see these future plans, we want to never use you again. I'm thinking that, a business is not exactly going to be, thrilled to do us any favors, and has every financial incentive to kind of squeeze us for all that we're worth. So in this scenario, if it's a price that we're not able to pay, or at least willing to pay, what's plan B?
There is no plan B other than trying to figure out a plan B. Because the only option is to go to a hand count, do a manual count, and we have a process for that.
We do? Oh, wow.
So if we had to do a citywide hand count, then that's what we do. And we look at those procedures and we get ready to go.
When was the last time we used those procedures?
We've never used them for a citywide. Whenever there's a potential for a recount, we always bring them out and look at them. And there's different levels of recount. Like for the ranked choice, requires a different approach than does it's much more involved. So that would be what we would do if there was no other option. Hasn't been my experience though that the worst case scenario is what we face. And there's also market forces in play. Someone doesn't really want to have that sort of a reputation hanging out there.
I was going to say,
yeah.
They do have a corporate reputation to
Yeah.
maintain as well in this public sector space. So,
And this market's very loud, so if you do something in San Francisco, it's not
Everyone
like
will
it
know.
gets, in multiple languages. So it's not like it's just a small time thing in county or something like that. It's a big deal.
lastly, when do you think at this point you would let the RFP for this replacement system? I know that you wanted to have it help somebody to write it, and you don't have that.
Yeah. I've got to get it out this month. I just have to get it. I want to get it done. I want to get it done this month. And then get it out before the end of the year for sure. Because we have other stuff coming, plus the elections coming up.
Right.
And then when the business case, if there's any activity around the business case, around any kind of RFPs, and we got to do that. So I want to have this one already in gear before that happens. So yeah, I'd like to get it done this month. Like I said, I've got the it seems small, but I got all the formatting stuff done with the template, which takes forever. And I've taken out the language that we don't need in that RFP. I've gone through. So now it's a scope of work in the supporting documentation appendices. But I don't know if you guys have seen the RFP we wrote in 2005. It's just this really huge. We don't need to go that route this time because really we know what's on the market. We know what we're asking for. And it's a matter of term and cost really, and then some services which are unique to our jurisdiction. So yeah, so I want to get it done this month. my goal.
Which services are unique to our jurisdiction?
Well, ranked choice voting is one. Also, we have a far more full service ask of the vendor than do other jurisdictions. So like we ask for maintenance assistance, so because I want to make sure we've got parts. You know, if they're the ones doing the maintenance, they tend to show up with the parts, where if you're ordering it, of course the system we have now is old, which is a different story, but even if we were to switch to another system for SB40, I want to have them involved on the ground more than having to bring them in. And I want to have a relationship with the people when it comes to fixing, moving, implementing product for a couple of years if we go that direction, than just having people I don't know come in. So that's kind of unique. We have more assistance on election day out on the field, techs, than do most counties. There's more pressure to get the process rolling if there's an issue at the polls here than other places. Then some processes we will probably take over from the vendor, which would be the ballot, the formatting, the contest, because it'll be a newer software, it'll be more flexible. The software with the current system is very hard to operate. So yeah, so just stuff like that, figuring that out.
I'm ashamed to say I actually don't have this in my notes. Can you remind me of when our current system expires?
December 2018.
That's right, thank you.
Okay. I just want to mention, Commissioner Paris, that if you look in the contract document, of course, this may have been modified from standard, but if you look in section 8.1, it's called termination for convenience, which was mentioned by Director Arndt. So you can read the specific language. Again, this may have been altered from the boilerplate, but that gives you an idea.
No, that's standard. We didn't touch that.
Okay, so that would be the standard language on how the city handles that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, any other questions, comments, motions around the interim voting system replacement agenda item? Okay, public comment, and seeing no members of the public present.
Item 5, approval of minutes of previous meeting, discussion and possible action to approve minutes of the September 6, 2017 Bopec meeting.
I move to approve these excellent minutes done by our excellent secretary.
Thank you,
I
Commissioner.
second that motion.
Secretary Chan, would you please call the roll?
Commissioner Donaldson,
Yes.
Vice President Harris,
Yes.
Commissioner Sabah.
Yes.
The vote carries unanimously.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, I did not ask for any commissioner comment, but I didn't have any, and since we had the motion, so I presume that's okay?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Agreed.
Didn't miss any comments. Great, thank you. And again, public comment? Seeing no members of the public.
Number 6, agenda items for future meetings. Discussion and possible action regarding items for future agendas.
So on this one, I guess I just sort of like to anticipate, when do we expect to have the election plan, Director Arntz, for the 2018 election? Probably won't be till what, February or March?
I forget, I think it's 90 days before is when it was requested of us, so 3 months back from June.
Okay.
May, April, March, I guess.
Okay. So we would expect at least to have a meeting on that in March, and then budget cycle starts around the same time.
But budget starts now, actually. We're already involved in that. Then what we bring forward to the commission will be end of January and the first part of February.
Okay. Okay. So we can anticipate the likelihood of meetings at least in February or March, commissioners.
And the timeline would also say from slalom will be due at the end of January as well, correct?
That's correct.
Right.
So there may be reasons to have a meeting in advance of that, but we can at least anticipate February and March meetings for Bopec.
Anything else on the burner for sooner?
Not that I have, commissioners, anything on your
I
part?
can't think of anything.
Okay. And public comment on the agenda item, seeing no members of the public. Meeting is adjourned at 6:36 p.m.